The morning they brought the buffalo was a Tuesday in late August of '98. I remember the air was the color of old brass and smelled of dust and distant thunder that never came. The heat had been sitting on the county for a good 6 weeks, a heavy, breathless thing that bleached the sky to a pale, hazy white by noon. The ground was cracked open in polygons, hard as fired brick. It was the kind of heat that makes you move slow, makes you think twice before you pick up a tool you left sitting in the sun. The truck that brought them was a long, low gooseneck trailer, paint flaking off the steel sides, pulled by a diesel that sounded tired. It wheezed up the lane a little after 7, just as the sun was clearing the ridge and starting to mean business. 18 of them. That was the count. Not a herd, just a collection of what was left over. The man driving the truck didn't say much. He was just glad to have them off his hands. I'd paid $50 a head, which was $50 more than anyone else was willing to offer. He'd have taken them to slaughter, but the processor said their condition was too poor, not enough meat on them to make it worth the trouble. So they were my problem now. My wife, Ellen, stood on the porch with her arms crossed, holding a mug of coffee she hadn't touched. She watched them come down the ramp, one by one. They were a sorry sight, sway-backed, most of them with ribs showing like washboards under dull, dusty hides. Their horns were splintered and worn. Their eyes were cloudy. They moved like old men with sore joints, stiff and uncertain. They were the ghosts of buffalo, the kind of animals you see in a photograph from 100 years ago after a hard winter. 18, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, and the fact had weight. That's the count, I said, not looking at her. I was watching the last one, a big old cow with a notched ear, as she stepped onto my ground and stood there, blinking slow in the new light. And what are you planning on doing with 18 sway-backed buffalo on 80 acres of pasture that won't even support a half-dozen steers? Her voice was flat, practical. It's one of the things I've always counted on. She doesn't deal in sentiment. She deals in numbers, in rain gauges and hay bales and the price of diesel. I told her I was putting them on the South 80. This didn't improve her mood. The South 80 was the worst piece of ground we had. It had been in my family for 120 years, and for the last 50 of them, it had been considered all but useless. The soil was thin, the grass was sparse, and it had no water. The big well that fed the rest of the farm was a half-mile away, on the other side of a rocky ridge. Hauling water out there was a fool's errand. You're putting them on the dry pasture, she said. Another fact. For now, I said. The animals milled around the loading ramp, smelling the air. They didn't seem spooked or eager to run. They just seemed tired. They looked like they had been standing on a concrete pad for a long time. They lowered their big heads and began to lip at the burned-out stalks of thistle and chicory, ignoring the bit of green clover near the fence. It wasn't long before my neighbor, Frank Miller, pulled up. He drives one of those new pickups, the kind that's never seen a muddy field, all chrome and polish. He idled at the fence line, the air conditioner humming so loud I could hear it from 20 yards away. He leaned a clean elbow out the window. He's a good 10 years younger than me, full of new ideas from the university extension, all about rotational grazing and maximizing protein conversion and soil sample grids. He'd taken over his father's place and quadrupled the herd, all with pivot irrigators and computer-fed supplement schedules. He meant well. He always did. "Morning," he called out, a polite smile on his face. Saw the truck. Getting into something new. I walked over to the fence. Just a small acquisition, I said. He looked past me at the buffalo. They had started to move off in a slow, shuffling bunch, heading south, away from the main farm, toward the useless 80 acres. He watched them for a long time. I could see him counting. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was adding up the cost of the animals, the cost of the feed they'd need, the cost of the water I'd have to haul, and setting it against the market price for a broken-down buffalo. The number came out to a significant loss. "They're a little thin," he said, which was his way of being kind. "They've had a hard run of it," I agreed. "Putting them out on the South 80? He asked. I nodded. He looked out at that piece of ground, shimmering in the heat. "Not much out there for them. There's enough," I said. He gave another polite smile, the kind you give a man you think has finally let the sun get to him. Well, don't you go running a hose all the way from your well. The pressure drop over that distance, you'll burn your pump out in a month. I ran the numbers on it once. He was trying to be helpful. He was always trying to be helpful. I'll keep that in mind, I said. He lingered for another moment, then put the truck in gear. You let me know if you need a hand, he said. Looks like you're starting up a boneyard museum. He laughed a little as he said it, to show it was a joke. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was buying up sick animals. I was starting a charity ranch for buffalo that were too old to walk. I was losing my mind, spending good money on bad stock and putting them on ground that couldn't grow rocks. I let them talk. I went out to the South 80 fence line and watched my new herd. They hadn't scattered. They were already clustered together in the far southern corner, in a low swale I hadn't paid much mind to in 30 years. They were just standing there, heads down, as if they were waiting for something. I didn't know then what they knew. I didn't understand that their old bones remembered something the land had forgotten. I just had a feeling, a whisper of a memory from a long time ago. An animal's thirst, my grandfather used to say, is an older map. And these animals looked very, very thirsty. The story about the old man and his broken buffalo got around fast. In a small community, news travels on its own schedule, and stories about your neighbors, especially stories that confirm what everyone already suspected, they travel at the speed of gossip. The consensus was that I'd finally slipped a gear. It wasn't mean-spirited, not really. It was more a kind of affectionate pity. They'd seen my father work this land, and his father before him. They knew our family wasn't prone to foolishness. So my sudden venture into geriatric buffalo ranching was seen as a sign of decline, a quiet softening of the mind. The next week, I got a visit from the county water agent. His name was Kevin, a young man, barely 30, with a degree in hydrology and a clipboard full of data. He was out checking water levels in the monitoring wells, a precaution during the drought. He was polite, earnest, and absolutely certain about what his numbers told him. He saw the buffalo from the road and pulled his white county truck up the lane, a plume of dust trailing behind him. He found me reinforcing the fence on the South 80. The buffalo weren't jumpers, but the wire was old and I didn't want to give them any ideas. Kevin leaned against a post, took off his hard hat, and wiped his brow. "Heard you got some new livestock," he said, gesturing with his clipboard toward the herd. They were in the same spot they'd been in since they arrived, that low swale in the far corner. "They're not much to look at," I said. "No, sir, they are not," he said with a chuckle. "Frank Miller was telling me you put them out here. On the dry 80-inch, he called it that, too. Everyone did." "That's the place," I said, stretching a new strand of wire with the come-along. "Well, I don't want to tell you your business," he started, which is what people always say right before they tell you your business. "But I was just looking at the geological survey maps for this section. We updated them last year with ground-penetrating radar." He flipped through the pages on his clipboard. "Your main well is tapping the Coconino Aquifer at 310 feet. Solid performer. But over here," he tapped a colored section of the map that corresponded to the South 80. "Over here, you've got a solid shelf of impermeable shale starting at about 50 feet down and going for another 200. The aquifer is way down below that, 450 feet, maybe 500. There's no surface water because there's nowhere for it to come from. Any rain you get just runs off that hardpan clay." He looked at me, his expression a mixture of professional certainty and genuine concern. "I'm just saying, hauling water out here for 18 head. That's going to be a full-time job. And with this drought, we're asking everyone to conserve." I thanked him for the information. I told him I appreciated him stopping by. He nodded, satisfied that he'd done his duty. "Just don't want to see you get in a bind," he said, and drove off, leaving me there with the hum of the cicadas and the weight of his data. His maps were correct. His numbers were accurate. The South 80 was dry. It had always been dry. My father had tried to drill a well there in the 60s, hit shale at 60 feet and gave up. Everything the young man said was the gospel truth, according to every modern measure. But I had a different kind of map I was looking at. It wasn't on a clipboard. It was in my head, a fading picture from when I was a boy. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, riding in my grandfather's truck. It was an old flatbed with a hand crank for a starter and a smell of oil and tobacco that never left the cab. We were driving the fence line of the South 80. It was a dry year then, too. The cattle we had on it were thin and restless. I remember him stopping the truck and just staring out at that pasture for a long time. He didn't say anything. He just looked the way a man does when he's trying to read a difficult page of writing. "They're all bunched up," I said, pointing to the cattle. They were clustered in the same corner where my buffalo now stood. "Yes, they are," he said. "They're thirsty." "There's no water there, Grandpa," I said, because even a boy of 8 knew that. He turned to me, his face creased and brown from the sun. "The land remembers where the water was," he said. "Sometimes, it just needs a reason to bring it up again." He never explained what he meant. He just put the truck in gear and we drove on. The memory had been buried for decades, a piece of old lumber in the back of the barn. But seeing those buffalo standing on that exact spot, it came back to me as clear as the day it happened. That was my real reason. It wasn't charity. It wasn't sentiment. It was a hunch, a long shot, based on a dead man's cryptic words and the instinct of 18 worn-out animals. That evening, after Ellen was asleep, I went out to the workshop. In a heavy cedar chest where my grandfather kept his surveying tools and leather-bound ledgers, I started looking. The chest smelled of cedar and thyme. I dug past the chains and the plumb bob, past the tax records from the 1950s, until my fingers touched it. A small, marbled composition book. The cover was soft with age, stained with oil from 100 greasy thumbprints. The binding was held together with black electrical tape, a repair he must have made 50 years ago. I took it back to the house and sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb that hangs over the sink. I opened it. The pages were filled with his handwriting, a tight, careful script in pencil that had gone brown over the years. This was his field book, his private record of the land. I spent a good hour just turning the pages of that notebook. It was like sitting with him again. His voice was in the words, terse and practical. He wasn't a man for poetry. He recorded facts. April 12, 1931. Wind from the north. 2 inches of snow, wet. Fixed fence by the creek. Calf number 42 born. A bull. Looks strong. He recorded rainfall in fractions of an inch, the price of corn by the bushel, the dates he moved the herd from one pasture to another. It was the simple, hard arithmetic of a farmer's life. I could see the years pass in the entries. The good years, with notations of heavy hay crops and fat cattle. The bad years, with their litany of dust, wind, and low prices. I kept turning, looking for a specific time. I was looking for the worst years, the ones that would have tested a man and the land to their limits. I found them in the section marked with a faded tab for the 1930s. The entries got shorter. The tone got grimmer. May 20th, 1934. No rain since March. East wind for 11 days straight. Topsoil gone from the high field. June 2nd, 1934. Moved the last of the herd to the South 80. It's all we have left with any cover. Praying for rain. He wasn't a man who prayed often, or at least not one who wrote it down. Reading that felt like an intrusion, like hearing a private thought. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I knew what was coming. The stories of the Dust Bowl were legends in our part of the country, passed down like Bible stories. My grandfather had lived through it. This notebook was his testimony. I turned the page. The entry was dated August 1st, 1934. It was short, and the pencil had been pressed hard into the paper, as if he was writing with a kind of desperate intensity. It read, "Dry year. Herd won't leave South Corner. Standing over the swale day and night. Dust wallows are 6 feet deep. They're not just rolling. They're digging." And then, at the bottom of the page, a final line, almost an afterthought, with a small question mark drawn next to it in the margin. Muck? Bedrock seep? That was it. That was the map. It wasn't a treasure map with an X marking the spot. It was a question. A flicker of hope from a man in the middle of a disaster. He had seen something, some sign that the animals were sensing water where none should be. He had seen them digging not for comfort, but with purpose. Muck, a word that means wet earth, black and rich and full of life. A word you would not expect to see in a journal entry from the driest year in recorded history. Bedrock seep? He was guessing. He was wondering if there was a crack in that impenetrable shelf of shale the county agent was so sure about. A place where water, under pressure from deep below, might find its way to the surface. I closed the notebook. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I'll own this. I had seen that entry before. Years ago, when my father passed and I was cleaning out his things, I had read through this notebook. I'd seen that line and it had registered as a curiosity, a historical footnote. But I hadn't understood it. I hadn't connected it to the land I was walking every day. I had the data, but I didn't have the context. I put the notebook back in the cedar chest because I wasn't ready. Knowing something and acting on it are two different things. But now, with 18 ancient buffalo standing on that very spot, refusing to move, the context had arrived. It had been delivered on a gooseneck trailer. I didn't rush out there the next morning with a shovel. That's not my way. The modern world wants answers right now. It wants to drill a hole, run a test, get a number, and move on. My grandfather's way, the way I was taught, was to watch, to pay attention. The land doesn't give up its secrets easily. You have to earn them with patience. So I began my investigation. It was an investigation of stillness. Every morning, just after dawn, I take a thermos of coffee and walk out to the fence line of the South 80. I'd sit on the tailgate of my old truck and just watch. The buffalo were my instruments. They were my divining rods. They never varied. They would graze for an hour or so on the sparse, dry grass, moving as a single unit, and then, as the sun began to climb, they would retreat to the swale. They would stand there for hours, crowded together, their big heads hanging low. They weren't chewing their cud. They weren't sleeping. They were just present, concentrated, a weight on the land. By midday, they'd begin to paw at the ground. Not all of them, just a few of the older cows. They'd hook a horn into the hard-packed clay and pull, creating a shallow depression. Then they would lie down in it, rolling their massive bodies in the dust. My grandfather had seen it 60 years before. Dust wallows. But just like he'd written, they weren't just rolling. They were digging. Every day, the depression got a little wider, a little deeper. They were focusing their energy, all 18 of them, on a patch of ground no bigger than my living room. I was watching them, and they were teaching me where to look. The investigation was slow, but it was not idle. It was a deliberate gathering of evidence, a conversation with the land where the land did most of the talking. The weeks of late summer bled into a dry and dusty September. The sun baked the South 80 until the ground was the color of pale ash. The buffalo looked thinner. I was hauling water, just as Frank Miller and the county agent had predicted. I filled a 50-gallon trough near the fence line, a good 100 yards from their chosen spot. They would come and drink dutifully, but as soon as they had their fill, they would walk right back to the swale. They were telling me something. They were telling me the water I was giving them was in the wrong place. My slow investigation moved from observation to something more direct. I got out my old soil probe. It's a simple tool, a 3-foot steel rod with a T-handle and a hollow, slotted tip. You push it into the ground, give it a twist, and pull up a core sample. It tells you what you have under your feet. Clay, sand, loam, rock. I started walking a grid. I'd learned the method from the university extension, the same place Frank Miller got his ideas. The irony was not lost on me. I was using a modern technique to chase an ancient hunch. I started 100 feet north of the swale and took a sample. The probe went in 6 inches and stopped hard. I had to put my full weight on it to get it to go any deeper. When I pulled it up, the core was just what I expected. 2 inches of gray, dusty topsoil, followed by a thick layer of reddish-orange clay, dry as chalk and hard as a rock. I moved 10 feet south and tried again. Same result. I spent the better part of a week doing this, working my way across that corner of the pasture. I laid out a grid with little orange flags, taking a sample every 10 feet. It was methodical, backbreaking work. The sun was relentless. My hands were raw from the steel handle of the probe. Every core I pulled was the same. Dry clay, hardpan. Felt like I was proving the county agent right. The ground was a dead, impermeable shelf. I kept my own notes in a small spiral-bound book. I drew a map of the area and marked the result of each probe. My page was filled with a monotonous series of notations. Dry. Hardpan at 8 inches, dry. Hardpan at 6 inches. I was starting to doubt myself. The diner gossip, the polite certainty of the experts, my wife's silent, practical questions. It was all starting to feel heavier than the heat. Maybe I was just an old fool chasing a ghost. Maybe my grandfather's note was just the desperate hope of a man watching his world blow away. I was on my last line of flags, the one that passed right through the center of the wallow the buffalo had been working. They watched me as I approached, their dark eyes following my every move. They didn't move away. They just shifted their weight, giving me room to work. I found the center of the depression. The ground here was different. It was churned up, pulverized into a fine powder. I set my feet and pushed the probe down. It slid in. There was no resistance. It sank a foot, then 2 feet with just the pressure of my hands. I pushed it all the way down to the hilt, the full 3 feet. My heart was pounding. It wasn't the heat. I twisted the handle and pulled it back up. The slot was packed with a core sample unlike any I had seen on that piece of land. The top foot was the same pulverized dust from the wallow. But below that, the soil changed. It was a deep, dark brown, almost black. It was cool to the touch. I crumbled a piece between my thumb and forefinger. It was damp. It held its shape. Felt greasy, like clay that has been wet for a very long time. It was muck. I hadn't found a spring. I hadn't found a gusher. But I had found what my grandfather had suspected. There was moisture here, trapped deep under the hardpan, in a place where no map said it could be. The buffalo knew. They hadn't been digging for water. They had been digging for the coolness, for the memory of water that the ground held. Their instincts had led them to the one spot in 80 acres where the seal was weakest, where the deep dampness was closest to the surface. Their combined weight, their constant milling and pawing, was a form of slow-motion drilling. They were tenderizing the earth, breaking down that hard seal, millimeter by millimeter. I took a dozen more samples in and around the wallow. The results were all the same. Outside the wallow, bone dry. Inside it, this deep, cool, damp earth. I sat on the ground, the soil probe across my lap, and watched the buffalo. They had gone back to their quiet standing, their work for the day done. They had shown me the spot. Now it was my turn. I still didn't have any answers, not really. I just had a better question. And I knew the animals were the key. They were the ones who would have to finish the job. I filled their trough with water and a scoop of mineral supplement. They needed their strength. The work was slow, and winter was coming. The autumn of '98 was one of the driest in memory. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned a sickly yellow and dropped before they ever got a chance to be gold. The ponds on the north pastures shrank, their edges cracking into wide, muddy plates. I kept hauling water to the South 80, feeling Frank Miller's eyes on me every time I drove the water tank past his place. He never waved. He'd just watch me go by, a slow-moving testament to stubborn foolishness. The buffalo seemed to sense the urgency in the air. Their work in the wallow became more focused. They were no longer just pawing at the surface. They were hooking their horns into the damp soil I had found and pulling up chunks of it, tossing it aside. They were excavating. The depression grew not so much wider as deeper. It was a strange and patient kind of engineering. All their collective weight and energy, thousands of pounds of it, was being brought to bear on that one small patch of ground. They were a living hammer, striking the same spot over and over. I continued my own work, my own form of watching. I drove a piece of rebar into the ground at the edge of the wallow and took a measurement of its depth every morning. It was sinking, but slowly. A half-inch one day, a quarter-inch the next. It was a geological process, not a farming one. Patience was the only tool that was going to work here. One morning in early November, the first hard frost arrived. The temperature had dropped to 25 degrees overnight. The world was coated in a layer of white, glittering crystals. The water in the stock tanks had a skin of ice on it. I drove out to the South 80, expecting to see the ground frozen solid. And most of it was. The pasture was hard as iron under my boots. But as I got closer to the wallow, I saw something that made me stop. The ground inside the wallow, the dark, churned-up earth, was not frozen. It was black and soft. A faint wisp of vapor, like a man's breath on a cold day, was rising from it. The earth itself was breathing. The deep, trapped moisture was creating its own geothermal heat, just enough to resist the frost. The buffalo were all standing around the edge, their own breath pluming in the cold air. They were looking down into the hole they had made, as if waiting for a kettle to boil. They had broken through something. The seal was getting weaker. I didn't get my hopes up. This wasn't a discovery. It was just another piece of evidence. Another sentence in the long conversation I was having with the land. The real test would be what happened next. The cold held for a week. Every morning, the same scene. The land around the wallow was frozen white, and the wallow itself was a dark, steaming patch in the middle of it. The buffalo kept working. They were pulling up mud now, not just damp soil. Sticky, black mud that clung to their horns and faces. The hole was now a good 4 feet deep in the center. It was still just a muddy pit, but it was a significant pit. On the 8th day, the weather broke. A warm front moved in from the south, and the temperature climbed into the 50s. The frost melted, turning the world to a damp, brown smear. I went out in the afternoon to check on the herd, and I saw it. In the very bottom of the wallow, in the deepest hoof print, there was a shimmer. It was water, not a puddle from the melting frost. This was new water, clear water. It was only a cupful, maybe 2, but it was seeping up from below. I stood there for I don't know how long, just staring at that little bit of light in the mud. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I knew then that I needed a different kind of expert. Not a man with a map and a clipboard, but a man who understood the ground in his hands. I called a man named George Albright. He was a well driller, retired now for 20 years. He was in his 80s, but his mind was as sharp as a new drill bit. He drilled half the wells in the county, including the one my father gave up on. He didn't work from geological surveys. He worked from instinct, from the way the willow trees grew, from the color of the soil. He read the land like my grandfather did. I told him I had something strange I wanted him to see. He said he'd be out the next morning. He arrived in a truck that was even older than mine, a '68 Ford with mismatched fenders. He was a small, wiry man with hands like gnarled roots. He didn't say hello. He just got out of his truck and said, "All right, where is it?" I walked him out to the South 80. The buffalo watched us come. They parted slowly, letting us through to the wallow. George stopped at the edge and looked down. The little bit of water was still there, maybe a little more of it now. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked. He looked at the mud, at the way the buffalo had worked the ground. He looked at the buffalo themselves, at their patient, heavy stillness. He walked around the perimeter of the wallow, his eyes on the ground. He bent down, picked up a handful of the black mud, and crumbled it in his palm. He brought it to his nose and smelled it. Finally, he straightened up and looked at me. "How long they been at this?" he asked. "Since August," I said. 18 head. "That's right," he nodded slowly, still looking at the seep. He went quiet again. It was a comfortable silence. The silence of a man who is listening to something you can't hear. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass. A hawk circled high overhead. The buffalo stood like statues, waiting for a verdict. George had become the expert who goes quiet, the man whose silence means more than another man's speech. He was seeing the whole story, the years of drought, the ancient memory of water, the patient work of the animals. He was confirming not just a fact, but a faith. George Albright finally broke the silence. He wiped his muddy hand on his trousers and looked past me, toward the distant line of hills. "This isn't groundwater from the aquifer," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. The boy from the county is right about that. The aquifer's way too deep here. You could drill for a week and not hit it." He paused, then pointed a gnarled finger down into the muddy wallow. "That there is a perch table. Pocket. You've got a lens of porous sand and gravel trapped between two layers of that clay the boy loves to talk about. It's been collecting water for 1,000 years, a little at a time, from that fault line that runs through the ridge." I must have looked confused. "There's no fault line on the maps," I said. He gave a dry chuckle. "The maps don't show everything. The maps show what a machine can read from 100 feet up. They don't show you the way the rocks are fractured 50 feet down. This land shifted here a long, long time ago, before men were here. Created a crack in that shale bedrock. Not a big one, just a seep. Water from deep down under artesian pressure has been leaking up that crack for centuries, filling that little pocket of sand." He looked from the seep to the buffalo, and a look of real admiration came into his eyes. "That pocket was probably sealed on top with a cap of hardpan clay so thick you could drive a bulldozer over it and never know it was there. And you never would have." He looked at me then. "Except for them," he gestured to the buffalo. "You can't drill for a pocket like this. You'd miss it by 5 feet and never know it. It's too small, too localized. The only thing that could find it is something that could feel the coolness, smell the dampness right through the ground. And the only thing that could break that seal without a machine was weight. Constant, patient weight. 18 head, you said? That's what, 25,000 pounds? Standing here, stomping here, pounding here, day after day for 4 months. They broke it open. They just hammered it until the seal gave way." He used a single, restrained word. "Substantial," he said, looking at the seep. "The pressure's good. It won't ever be a gusher. It won't run an irrigator. But it's a spring. A damn fine 1 inch." That was the vindication. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, raspy word from an old man who knew the earth. The work wasn't over. George came back the next day with a post-hole digger and some sections of perforated pipe. We worked together, the two of us, digging down into the center of the wallow. The buffalo watched us, their job done, as if they were supervising the new contractors. We sank a 4-foot pipe into the muck, packed gravel around it, and by the end of the day, clear, cold water was welling up inside it, about 6 inches from the top. The flow was steady. I measured it with a bucket and a stopwatch. 3 gallons a minute. It doesn't sound like much, but 3 gallons a minute is 4,320 gallons a day. It was more than enough to water my herd. It was enough to change everything about that piece of land. We ran a short pipe from the collection point to a new trough, and then dug an overflow channel that led to the lowest point of the swale. Within a week, a small pond had formed, no bigger than a pickup truck. The buffalo drank from the trough, then waded into the pond, sinking into the cool water with what looked like pure satisfaction. They had made their own oasis. The news did not cause a sensation in town. There was no headline in the local paper. The vindication was quieter than that. It was personal. It was the feeling of the cool, damp air near the new pond. It was the sight of green shoots of sedge and rush beginning to sprout at the water's edge, even in the dead of winter. It was the knowledge that a question asked by my grandfather in 1934 had finally been answered by his grandson in 1998, with the help of 18 animals nobody wanted. The proof was in the numbers. I was no longer hauling 400 gallons of water a day. My fuel bill dropped by $70 a month. The buffalo, with a reliable source of clean water and the mineral-rich mud to wallow in, began to change. Their coats lost their dullness. They started to fill out, the sharp angles of their ribs softening. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. The clever, expensive, modern approach had been to write the land off. The data said it was worthless. The maps said it was empty. But the old, patient thing, the instinct of an animal, the cryptic note in a faded journal, had revealed a truth the data could never find. The land wasn't empty. It was just quiet. It was waiting for someone, or something, to listen. The greatest proof came that spring. The land around the little pond, fed by the constant overflow, turned a shade of deep, vibrant green you wouldn't see anywhere else in the county during a dry year. It spread out in a circle, a perfect emerald oasis in the middle of the pale, tan pasture. It was a beacon. You could see it from the county road a mile away. By the following May, the South 80 was transformed. The small pond, fed by the steady 3 gallons a minute seep, had stabilized. It was about a half-acre in size, fringed with cattails and rushes. The green pasture around it had spread to cover nearly 10 acres. It was the richest patch of grazing on my entire farm. The buffalo were fat and sleek. A few of the cows were pregnant. They were a herd now, not just a collection of survivors. They had healed themselves, and in doing so, they had healed a piece of the land. One afternoon, I saw Frank Miller's polished truck slow down on the county road. He pulled over onto the shoulder and just sat there for a few minutes, looking out at the impossible circle of green. I was mending fence not far off, and I watched him. He didn't get out of the truck. He just stared. I knew what he was seeing. He was seeing water where his maps told him there was none. He was seeing lush pasture on ground his soil samples told him was poor. He was seeing healthy animals that he had dismissed as a boneyard museum. I didn't walk over to him. I didn't wave. I just kept stretching my wire, letting him look. After a while, he put his truck back in gear and drove up my lane. He stopped where I was working and rolled down his passenger side window. The air conditioning washed over me, cool and artificial. "Afternoon," he said. "Frank." I nodded. He looked past me, toward the pond where a few of the buffalo were standing shoulder-deep in the water, lazy and content. He didn't smile. He just looked, his face serious, contemplative. He was recalculating. He was a man who lived by data, and the data in front of him was contradicting everything he knew. "That's not as dry as it was," he said. It was the biggest concession he could make. It was an admission that his world of certainties, of satellite maps and soil reports, had a hole in it. A hole the size of a half-acre pond on a piece of useless ground. "No," I said. "It's not." He nodded once. A short, sharp gesture. "You might not be as wrong as I thought," he said. Then he rolled up his window, put the truck in reverse, and drove away. That was it. That was the victory speech. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't gloating. It was a quiet moment between two farmers, a grudging acknowledgement that there are things the new ways can't measure and the old ways can't forget. In that moment, I felt a profound connection to my grandfather. He had stood on this same land, looked at this same corner, and wondered. He had written down his question, his quiet hope, and left it for someone else to find. He had planted a seed of curiosity that took 64 years to sprout. The land remembers where the water was. He had been right. It just needed a reason to bring it up again. The 18 sway-backed buffalo nobody wanted were the reason. They were the key. Their ancient instincts, their deep, cellular memory of how to find water, had unlocked a secret the land had held for 1,000 years. They weren't broken-down animals. They were living libraries of a knowledge that we've lost. They listened to the earth in a way we no longer can. An animal's thirst is an older map, and it leads to places our own maps have erased. There's a lesson in that, I think. We get so certain about what we know. We have our data, our charts, our expert opinions. We trust the numbers that tell us what is and what is not possible. And we forget to look at the thing itself. We forget to watch. We forget to be patient. We forget that the land, and the animals that live on it, have their own wisdom. It's a quieter, slower wisdom than ours, but it's been right for a lot longer than we have. It's a lesson about trusting the old things, the old knowledge passed down in a shaky hand, the old instincts of a creature that has been walking this ground since the last ice age, the old, patient way of letting the answer reveal itself in its own time. The world is full of these hidden springs, these overlooked pockets of value. There, in the pieces of land everyone calls useless, in the old tools everyone has thrown away, in the quiet wisdom of our elders that we're too busy to listen to. The trick is learning how to see them. The trick is learning who to ask. Sometimes the best expert is the one with 4 legs and a dusty coat. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, your own herd of overlooked animals, your own cryptic note from the past, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know about the hidden springs you've found. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There are more stories here to tell.